with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Thank you so much for checking in. Wherever you are in the world, I have a return guest, and this is Jim Kouzes, and he is the co-author of the award-winning best-selling book, The Leadership Challenge, and more than a dozen other books on leadership, including the 2021 book, Everyday People, Extraordinary Leadership. He is also a fellow of the Door Institute for New Leaders at Rice University. The Wall Street Journal named Jim one of the 10 best executive educators in the U.S., and he has received the Distinguished Contribution to Workplace Learning and Performance Award from the American Society for Training and Development, among many other professional honors. The 7th edition of the Leadership Challenge was released recently. And Jim, as I have said to you before, the Leadership Challenge is where it all began for me. As far as the academic pursuit of what it means to be an extraordinary leader and get extraordinary things done, it started with the Leadership Challenge in a discussion group led by my supervisor at 7 a.m. on Thursday mornings. And so that's
a little early for talking about leadership.
You know what, though? I think the year is probably about 1998, and we were just enthralled. And so your work has a special place in my heart. The work of you and Barry, and it's just so wonderful that it has stood the test of time the way it has.
Thank you, Scott.
Well, today we could, and we've discussed this a little bit, we could kind of go down the path of what are the 5 practices. I think individuals who don't know the 5 practices should probably pause the podcast, go read the Leadership Challenge 7th edition, and then come back to our discussion. But something I love about your work and something that I very, very much respect, and especially I noticed this in the 7th edition, I imagine it's happening in other editions as well, but you're weaving in some of the research that you're gathering about the 5 practices. And so where I would love to start our conversation today is obviously this work was rooted in some of that research. So maybe give us a little bit of a history lesson as to the foundations of some of the work, and then we'll zoom forward to 2023 to edition 7.
Well, thank you for that opportunity, Scott. It is, I love telling the backstory of how we got to where we are. It's fun to tell, it's fun to listen to. And if you'll permit me, I'll give you a little context for this beginning. I was at Santa Clara University, and I had met Barry Posner when I first arrived. You know, Barry, this very tall, 6'4" guy, standing in my doorway of my new office at Santa Clara University, knocked on the door and said, "Hey, you're in my office." And I said, "Well, what are you?" "I'm sorry, Barry, I thought this was my office. The dean told me this was my office." And he said, "Oh, it is your office. I was just kidding. It was my office, however, once before, but I've moved to the building across the commons. This is your office. And hey, if you want to meet some people, get to know the campus, have lunch, the faculty club, I'd love to have a chat. And that began what's now been a friendship that started in 1981 and is still going, 42 years later, with him and his family, and kind of we've all grown up together. And Barry and I, when you spend enough time with someone, you find you have some common interests, and we had common interest in values. And so we did a little project together with Warren Schmidt, and we wrote on Shared Values Make a Difference, the very first paper we wrote together. And then we started to explore more deeply our common interest in leader behavior. And we did a seminar with Tom Peters in the early part of 1983, where Tom was speaking on In Search of Excellence, the very first day of the seminar. And Barry and I were talking the second day on excellent managers. Tom had a book and a model and some research. Barry and I only had some ideas. So we had our ideas about, what we might say, but we didn't have the same kind of data and big, thick book to rely on. So what we did was we asked the participants in the seminar that day to do a little pre-work. And then the pre-work was to tell us a story, write a story that you're going to tell to other people on that second day in the seminar on your personal best leadership experience. And so there were about 60 participants in that seminar room that day in that amphitheater, and they all had the story to tell. We broke them into small groups, and they talked about their personal best leadership experiences. And then we said, record your findings from your conversation. What were the common themes on newsprint? And they went and put them on the hall, the Kenna Hall, right out opposite Kenna Hall 107 at Santa Clara University in the business school. And they walked down the hall, and as we did, and we read all the report outs from each of the small groups. Well, lo and behold, something astonishing happened. That was to us. It was an aha moment. What we found was that there were a lot of common themes across all these stories. So everybody wrote a story about their personal best. So it was an individual event for them as managers in this particular case. Those are the first leaders we studied. But they all came from different contexts, different organizations, from financial institutions and high-tech companies, aerospace companies, local nonprofit organizations. And they all told these stories and yet had some common themes about what they did when they were at their best. And afterwards, and Barry and I were debriefing, we said, boy, there must be something here. We need to explore this further. So we started exploring it further. And what we came up with ultimately was the 5 practices of exemplary leadership. After, some hundreds of interviews, about 1,000 case studies, and literally writing specific behaviors on 3x5 cards and putting them into piles. Now, this was before we had computers to do all this analysis.
Do you still have those 3x5 cards?
I kept them for a long time, but after a while, I had to toss them, I'm sorry to say. But we did literally on tables, put them, those 3x5 in stacks, and what kind of common themes came up. Initially, there were more than 5, but when we did some analysis of it, we found that when we created an assessment based on that, which is now called the Leadership Practices Inventory, did a factor analysis, we came up with 5 independent factors, which are model the way, inspire a shared vision, challenge the process, enable others to act, and encourage the heart. And then we worked with the Leadership Practice Inventory to revise that assessment. Now, fast forward to where we are, 7th edition. That book, first edition, came out 87. This edition came out this year, 2023, in January. We continue to use the Leadership Practices Inventory as the measure of leader behavior, continuously updating it to make sure it's still a valid and reliable tool. Other people have used it. Now we have about 1,700 plus dissertations that have been based on the 5 practices model, and most of them use the LPI as their measure from, looking at military folks in the military leaders in education, university, secondary education principals. We were healthcare executives, nurses, people in high-tech companies, financial institutions. So we've got a broad range of respondents now. About 5 million people have responded to the LPI. Each year we update the data. Each time we do a new edition, we update data to be about, this last year, over 100,000. We analyzed for this particular book, this 7th edition. That's sort of the context in this. And I think it's really important to emphasize that Barry and I have always been interested in evidence-based leadership, not just one executive's thoughts about their experience running a company or multiple companies, but what do now thousands of people say about what leaders do when they're at their best, and does that make a difference?
In the 7th edition, I mean, I was saying before we got on, I just love when you are weaving in some of those findings to help support oftentimes what might be considered somewhat common sense, but it's just really, really nice to know, hey, this is actually supported and it's validated by what we're seeing in the data, right? And throughout the text, you're providing readers or listeners with those nuggets that I couldn't get enough of them. I just absolutely loved it. Would you share a few of the data points that you highlight in the 7th edition that maybe stood out for you or that you found were interesting?
Absolutely love to do that. And, recently I just, along with Barry, did an analysis of a specific outcome measure. We use about 10 outcome measures. So from commitment to the organization to teamwork, most people refer to this as engagement. We call it positive work attitudes. And one of those outcomes is the extent to which people trust their leader.
Yes.
And so did an analysis around that. And just to give a couple of examples of what we share in the book, as well as with our clients and with our students at university, let's take a look at just the behavior of the leader treats people with dignity and respect and correlate that. What's the relationship between that behavior and the frequency of use of that behavior and direct reports saying they strongly agree that they trust their leader? So if we look at the data on a 10-point scale, going from almost never to almost always, when people engage in that behavior, the leader treats people with dignity and respect, almost never or rarely, less than 1% trust their leader. But going at the other extreme, the other end of the continuum, when they engage in this behavior very frequently or almost always, 94% trust their leader.
Yeah. I mean, that's the stuff that I just absolutely loved throughout this book. It was those types of data points that just, put an exclamation point, bolded, underlined some of the statements that you all make, right?
I'm glad you love it because I love it too. And that's part of what Barry and I are hoping to do, is to communicate to people that you make a difference.
Yes.
And it's not who you are, meaning demographics. It's not about whether you're male or female, you're senior executive or a student leader at a university. It's not about whether you're a particular religious background or ethnic background. All of that stuff is important, but it's not what makes the difference in whether or not people, for example, trust their leader.
Yes.
Demographics, we look at 10 measures of demographics. If all of those combined, in terms of the accounting for the variance and why leaders have an impact on others, the amount of variance they account for is 0.3% combined, all of those 10 variables.
It's the behaviors.
It's the behaviors that make the most difference. They account for, depending upon whose study you read, anywhere from about 38%. Gallup says theirs accounts for 70%. Ours is more in the 40% range. But they account for more explanation of why leaders have an impact on others, leader behavior does, than any other factor.
Hit me with some more. What else you got?
Yeah, well, let's take another behavior under the practice model. The way is leaders are clear about their philosophy of leadership. And again, looking at the measure of trust, just as one outcome measure, going from, again, 1% at almost never or rarely, at the other end, very frequently or almost always 80%. trust their leader. We see this with every behavior, like sets a personal example. Again, from less than 1% to 85%. Follows through on promises from less than 1% to 86%. So the major message that comes out of all of this is the more frequently you engage in a particular behavior, you demonstrate a particular behavior, whether it's setting a personal example, following through on promises, being clear about your leadership philosophy, making sure that others adhere to standards, actively listening to diverse points of view, expressing confidence in others. Those are specific behaviors we measure. You see that the more frequently people engage in these behaviors, the percentage of people who say that they trust their leader or feel committed to the organization or feel like their team work is strong in the teams that they work in or have confidence in their leader goes from less than 1% to 79, 80 to up to 96, 97%. And if you add in to the numbers before that, you get almost 100%. In other words, you have to fairly often to almost always engage in these behaviors to get the highest levels of engagement.
Talk more about that. Fairly often or almost always engage in these behaviors.
Again, thinking about it, these are measures of frequency. So people are asked, here's a behavior.
Yep.
My leader sets a personal example based on the values we share. And then we ask people to respond. To what extent do they do that? How frequently do you observe this person demonstrating that behavior of setting an example or following through on promises? And it's a 1 to 10 scale. 1 is almost never, 10 is almost always. And then the numbers in between are from rarely to seldom, once in a while, occasionally, sometimes, etc., up to almost always.
Yeah.
People pick a number from their point of view as they observe a leader engaging in this behavior. Then that's correlated with the outcome measures, the what we call positive work attitudes.
Yeah.
And when you look at the behavior related to the outcome, you see that the higher the number, which is the higher the frequency that they observe a leader demonstrating this behavior, the higher the levels of engagement. The message is, just as an example, let me just ask you a question. If you were to observe a leader very infrequently listening to diverse points of view, how much trust would you have in that leader?
Yeah, exactly. Low.
Low versus very frequently, if not always, when I observe this person in a meeting, for example, he is listening actively to diverse points of view. I see that happen every time we're together.
Yeah.
If you see that over time, you're much more likely to trust the leader.
Yep.
Or be committed to the values of the organization, or less likely to leave and more likely to stick around when times are tough.
Well, and data like that, I mean, less likely to leave. I mean, engagement and retention at this point are such hot topics that there are real dollars or whatever your currency is, depending where you are in the world, associated with that, right?
Absolutely. The important message for everyone is if you want those kind of outcomes, both the financial outcomes, the emotional outcomes that result from this, the message is just engage in these behaviors more frequently. It's not rocket science here.
Yeah.
It really is just about doing things more often that we know have an impact.
Yeah.
We know that leaders who are clear about their philosophy of leadership, clear about their values and beliefs, are much more likely to have higher levels of engagement. So just make sure that you repeat over and over again what's important to the organization, what's important to the team, what values are important to us as we make decisions and take action. In the stories you tell, in the rewards that you acknowledge people with, in the speeches you give. Yes, and you might want to post them on the wall, but all the ways that you can possibly clarify for others what's important to you and the team. Make sure you do that.
Yep.
Make sure that when you say you're going to do something, that you follow through on that and you do it. And everybody can count on you doing that.
Well, and the durability of the 5 practices and the durability of your results has withstood a number of contextual shifts, right?
Yes. That's one of the things we observe particularly in this new edition, because the pandemic intervened between edition 6 and edition 7. We were just getting started writing the 7th edition when the world got locked down. March of 2020, we were just beginning to collect data and start writing the new edition when this happened. And we said, oh my goodness, this is a great field experiment. For one thing, we get to see what happens when a global crisis intervenes in every leader's life, no matter where they are, no matter what country you live in, no matter what type of organization you're in, type of community you're in, whatever your own personal philosophy is, we're going to see what happens. And it was a great field experiment, not one that anyone could plan, but it happened. And so we were able to collect data and found that even during some crisis like this, the more frequently leaders engaged in the behaviors like the ones we were just talking about, the more likely it was that people would remain engaged. So the message became clear that even in times of crisis and difficulty, it's still really important for leaders to engage in these exemplary behaviors if they want people to be engaged. And we concluded, and we went back, going back to the very first time we did personal best leadership. One of the things we noticed that in every single instance, the stories people told us about personal best leadership were about crisis, change, adversity, difficulty. That they were very different back in 1983, 1984, 1985, when we collected them. A lot of them were about starting up new companies or dealing with a recession or some of those kinds of challenges. But they were still challenges at that time. In 2020, in 2021, 2022, the challenges were very different kinds of challenges. Work from home, we're learning from home. You're having to work and learn from home with kids around that you didn't expect. You're having to learn new technologies like Zoom. You had to deal with, your potentially your business going out of business or at least temporarily shutting down. Different challenges, different crises. If you're in healthcare, we all know the crises that people in healthcare face. The very different challenges, but the common denominator when we ask people to tell us a story about a personal best leadership experience during this time, challenge was a common theme throughout. That challenge is the opportunity for exemplary leadership. Challenge is the crucible for developing exemplary leaders. And so the context of challenge has always been there. The specific type of challenge is going to change, but the context is there. And the good news for leaders is even when the contexts change, there are practices of exemplary leadership that still matter, that still make a difference. You don't have to learn, in other words, you don't have to learn a new model of leadership and a whole new set of leadership behaviors when times change.
Yes.
When the context changes. And we collect data globally, and the data we gathered said that this wasn't just true here, it was true also in other parts of the world.
Well, I'm excited because I'm going to be in Australia this summer working with an organization called Crestron, and we're talking about the 5 practices. So I'm excited that it holds cross-culturally as well. Are there any differences that you've come up with or that you've noticed, or any blips that have caught your attention when it comes to cross-cultural dimensions to the 5 practices?
Well, again, like with challenge being a context, every culture has its different differences. And, by the way, just as a sidebar, Barry spent, I think, 3 sabbaticals in Australia. they should be very familiar with the leadership challenge for anyone who puts in any of various classes. Back to the question. So yes, if you look at it, by the way, for anyone interested, on our website, leadershipchallenge.com, there's a paper that Barry pulled together, a white paper that Barry wrote called Bringing the Rigor of Research to the Art of Leadership. And there's a lot of data in there, and there's a lot of cross-cultural data. So
Okay.
for anyone who wants to geek out on numbers and look at some of the data and responses to the kind of questions you're asking, they can find it in that report.
Great.
And you can download it from our website under the Solutions tab at leadershipchallenge.com. So yes, there are cultural differences, but when you look at, again, the pattern of behavior, the model still holds. The more frequently in Australia you engage in the 5 practices of exemplary leadership, the more likely it is that people have positive work attitudes and higher levels of performance. The more frequently you do it in China, the more frequently you do it in the UK and European Union, the more frequently you do it in Latin America, South America, Mexico, the more frequently you do it in New Zealand, the more likely it is you'll have positive outcomes. So while cultures are different, the behaviors still hold up.
You know, Jim, I'd never thought of it this way. I recently had a conversation with Ron Riggio, and Ron at Claremont McKenna was talking about this study out of Fullerton that since 1978, they've been following this cohort of about 106 humans from age 1, forward. And they originally were interviewing the parents, and now as adults, they have a few data collection points on these individuals as well. But as you were talking, I wonder what would happen, and maybe this research has been done, I just don't know. Do the behaviors equal great parent? Do the behaviors equal great coach? Do the behaviors equal great priest or pastor or minister or person of faith? Do these have cross-role applications? Because I imagine they do. I imagine that if a parent is behaving in many of these ways, that you are going to have someone who's perceived and experienced as a great parent. So really, any person in a position of authority, are there some close connections? Has that ever been done?
We have looked at, you mentioned earlier when you were introducing me, and thank you again for that gracious introduction, that we had written a book called Everyday People, Extraordinary Leadership.
Yeah.
And in that book, we talk about people who aren't in managerial roles for the most part. These are mostly people who were engaged as volunteers in the community or in schools or at work, but they were not formal leaders.
Yes.
The model holds with people who are not in managerial roles where they have a title and they have the authority that goes along with it. And so it holds up in that role. We haven't looked at parents per se and these leadership behaviors as a separate study. But what we do find is these do hold up if you are not in a formal leadership role. So I would hypothesize that if we studied parents only and we asked their kids to rate them and their spouses on leadership behavior and looked at the frequency of these behaviors as applied to parents, changing the language a little bit so it's not organizational, but more family related, we'd find the same thing.
Ron was saying that something that came out of that research was that the family unit is so incredibly important as a determinant of leadership role occupancy and some other variables that they were finding in that research. But coaching, I just think of other, positions of authority where if you have an individual engaging in these behaviors, it's wonderful. And I'm so thankful for the work. And again, I was just blown away in this edition, tidbit after tidbit after tidbit, that I think is so incredibly pragmatic, useful, accessible for people doing the work day in, day out. And I love how you explain, the more often you engage in these behaviors, probably the more likely people are going to experience you as a great leader. Boom. Not rocket science. Maybe that's what we'll call the episode. It's not rocket science.
Not rocket science. I love it. To underscore the importance of what you just said about parents, we did in a separate study, starting with the first edition into this current edition. And so again, updated data, that we asked people to tell us, select from a list of, I think it was 8 different role model options, from business leader to entertainer to community leader, family member, professional athlete, family member, teacher or coach, to indicate which one, from which category did your most important leader role model come.
Mm.
And family member was the number one vote getter across all age groups.
Wow.
It occurred most frequently among those in our study who were under, kind of in the 16 to 30 age category, in the under 30 age category. But still, even if you were 50, it was more likely you would say a family member was your most influential role model. When people ask me who was my most influential leader role model, I say my dad.
Yeah.
My mom was second on my list. And so parents end up being the most frequently mentioned. Family member, who has an impact on our ideas about what good leadership looks like.
Yes.
So just imagine if that's the case. Just imagine if parents understood a little bit more about leader behavior and which leader behaviors were most important for them to engage in, like actively listening to their kids, to being clear about what you value and believe in, what's important to you, to talk about what you hope and aspire for the future, both for your family, for your kids, for the community, to talk about all those kinds of things with them, and, to help them develop and grow and as leaders themselves. Imagine how much more engagement we'd have in the workplace, engagement in the community, if we did that.
Well, I was with a group of frontline managers in an organization recently. And, again, if you go with Gallup's numbers or your numbers, it's a large percentage of how someone experiences the organization, their direct supervisor. And these folks didn't identify as leaders. They'd never thought of themselves as leaders, which is fascinating. And so we talked a lot about that. And that's part of why I was there. Like, look, you are the face of the organization to this large faction of the organization. It's you. It's not the CEO. It's you. No. And I think if more parents identified their role as a leadership opportunity, because you're leading a family, and in some cases you're co-leading the family with your partner. And I think it's a really interesting lens. I think it's a leadership opportunity. You're building a team. Are you providing a vision? Are you setting norms? Do you have traditions? Are you celebrating? I mean, again, it's all there.
It is all there. You're absolutely right. And I think one of the reasons I got into this work, I think back on this many times. My dad was a retired Deputy Assistant Secretary of Labor in the U.S. government, but he started out as a file clerk. Okay. And he just worked his way up. And people always identified my dad as gracious and generous and very supportive of them in their own work. At the time, I knew nothing about any of this. But, that experience and what other people told me about him shaped my perspective on him. And so I just have to believe that these were the kind of behaviors he was demonstrating to other people. And I know somewhere back then I was influenced to do the work I'm currently doing because of that behavior. And my mom, she was challenging a lot of the processes. She was challenging the status quo a lot in our community and our church. because of civil rights.
Mm.
She marched with Martin Luther King and during the Great March on Washington. She was very active in the United Nations Association, inviting people over to our home to have a meal with us. And eventually, many of them stayed for a year or more as they went to school as students. So I was exposed to a lot of different points of view. And my parents, really encouraged us to learn as much as we could about other cultures and to learn how to work with and live with and get along with people of diametrically opposed beliefs in some cases, just to understand where they're coming from. And to me, that was, a very fertile ground for me to learn about the impact of these kind of behaviors on someone growing up.
And all of those behaviors add up to your mind thinking of your dad and your mom as the most influential people, right?
Yes. I had some good mentors when I went to work. And by the way, teachers and coaches are number 2 on the list of role models for young people, followed by then when you go into work and you work for a few years in your organization, you have a manager and a supervisor. Immediate managers becomes number 2 on the list once one is in the workplace. Family members are still first, but then followed by immediate manager, which makes sense. You're farther removed from your teacher and coach in school, but your manager then becomes your teacher and coach. And if you have an exemplary manager who is using these behaviors, you're more likely to see that person as a role model for how you should behave as a leader. And so, managers can replace teachers and coaches as role models based on the behavior that they exhibit.
Well, for listeners, I hope you will pick up the 7th edition. It is definitely worth the read. It's an incredible, incredible piece of work. It's an incredible longitudinal piece of work. Again, we're going back a few decades here that Jim and Barry have been at this, and it's just, I greatly respect the work, sir. I really, really do. And I'm very appreciative for the work.
Thank you very much.
Now, we always close out by asking our guests what they've been listening to, reading, what they've been streaming, what's caught your attention in recent times. It could have something to do with leadership. It could have nothing to do with leadership. But what's caught your attention?
I just read the 2023 World Happiness Report.
Oh, okay.
Now, not someone's casual reading for the most part, but it caught my attention because of the work that we do. And of course, I'm hoping for world happiness, more world happiness than we currently have. But I have to tell you, Scott, one of the things that really struck me in both the 2022 and the 2023 World Happiness Report is the strong relationship between trust, and the way they measure it is more social trust and trust in institutions and trust in your neighbors than in organizations. So not looking at trust in the same way that Barry and I do. Trust in your manager, but really trust in your institutions. And there's a strong relationship between happiness and trusting your institutions.
Wow.
And trusting your neighbors. And interestingly enough, they took a look at COVID data and found that when trust is high in a community, there's lower morbidity rate from COVID.
Wow.
People who trusted institutions and were looking out for their neighbors were more likely to follow protocols that helped to mitigate the virus than those who had lower levels of trust. I think we all need to read that report and particularly the 2022 version, and understand how powerful trust in each other is when it comes to how happy we are and how healthy we are.
Wow.
In a totally unrelated read that I'm doing, it's my brother-in-law's new book called The Yin and Yang of It All, a rock and roll memoir from the cusp as told by a mixed race kid.
Okay.
The Yin and Yang of It All, a rock and roll memoir from the cusp is told by a mixed race kid. It's a tongue twister of a title, but my brother-in-law wrote a book. He is Asian and Irish. So his mom, my wife's mother, remarried and married an Irishman after many years being a single mom. She's Korean. And John is his name, John Fay. John is the son and the much younger brother of my wife and his sisters. And he wrote a book about his experience as a rock and roll musician. And it's a wonderfully told tale. And, I'm always looking for leadership lessons throughout. And I think, speaking about the role parents play and the influence that his mother had on his growing up, and also influence that music had, and how he found his voice through music. It's a very different kind of book than the 2023 World Happiness Report, but it's a wonderful story for any listener out there who's interested in music and how it can help shape someone. The Yin and Yang of It All by John Kim Fay is a really wonderful read. And back to more work-related stuff, I've also been reading The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness.
Okay.
By Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz. It's a longitudinal study of, what contributes to one's health and happiness over one's life. There's a one-word answer to their findings, and that's relationships.
Wow.
More than anything else, it's about the relationships and the quality of relationships you have over your lifetime. Account for a good life. I think the message here gets clearer and clearer. The kinds of relationships we have with other people, whether it's parents, whether it's one's leader, manager, or whether it's yourself in relationship to friends and family, that's really the biggest factor in what makes people healthy, happy, and engaged in what they do.
Yep. Well, that's a great place to end. Jim, I am so thankful for your time. I appreciate your work. Thank you for all that you do. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us today. And until next time, be well, sir.
Thank you very much, Scott. I look forward to that next time.
A short reflection today, the practical wisdom for me. How often are you engaging in the behaviors? It's not rocket science. Loved that. And then there was that little nugget at the end, and I can't wait to read this book, but it's all about relationships. It's all about relationships. How often are you engaging in the behaviors, and are we building relationships? Take care, everybody. Be well. As always, thank you so much for checking in. Thank you to Jim Kouzes. Just incredible work, incredible man, and so appreciate what he has contributed, along with Barry, to the field of leadership. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.